This video is sponsored by War Thunder. Check it out via the link in the description. Also, this video is part 2 in a 2-part series. You can watch part 1 by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. As British and Chinese warships clashed off the Chinese coast, news of the war started to reach Great Britain. When her people discovered that their government had just declared war on China, many were outraged and began a campaign to stop it. At the head of many of these campaigns were former abolitionist societies who had just successfully banned slavery in the British Empire. But they didn't just campaign against the war, but against the opium trade itself. The press, meanwhile, quickly condemned the conflict as the Opium War, a name that sticks to this day. All of this campaigning prompted the House of Commons to try and prevent the conflict. After much debate, Parliament just barely avoided censuring the government with a vote of 271 to 262. This vote was so close that if the cabinet ministers had not been allowed to vote against their own censure, they would have lost and been forced to resign. But instead, the House of Commons let them go, implicitly giving the war its sanction. There would be another attempt to stop the war in the House of Lords, but it also failed. During the debate, future 4-time Prime Minister William Gladstone summed up the mood of many in Britain when he said, "I am in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity towards China." How bad will that iniquity be? We're about to find out. But first, let me tell you about our most equitable sponsor, everyone's favorite vehicle combat game, War Thunder, and their special July event in collaboration with Atomic Heart, the first-person shooter set in a fallen Soviet utopia overrun by mutants and rebelling servant machines. For the month of July 2023, War Thunder is running an Atomic Heart-themed event where you take control of tanks and helicopters from the United States and Soviet Union and experimental combat robots from Atomic Heart to defeat the rebelling machines. Your rewards for victory include boosters, in-game currency, and unique Atomic Heart-themed vehicle decorations and avatar icons. It's no secret that I love War Thunder, especially its Israeli vehicle tree featuring the Merkava. But that's just one small part of War Thunder's massive lineup of over 2,000 tanks, warplanes, warships, and helicopters from every major and many secondary powers around the world, all the way from World War II to the modern day. The Atomic Heart event runs until the end of July 2023, but you can play War Thunder for free at any time by clicking our exclusive link in the description. New players will even get a free bonus pack, including vehicles and boosters. Thank you, War Thunder, for making this video possible. And now, back to the video. In June of 1940, the British Expeditionary Fleet began to arrive in Hong Kong. En route leading this force was George Eliot, the cousin of the very same Charles Eliot who started the war. Both Eliots were made plenipotentiaries, empowering them to negotiate the final treaty when the time came. When enough ships arrived to begin the campaign, a small force was left behind to blockade Canton, while the rest moved north to capture the city of Tinghai on the Chusan archipelago, which the British hoped to turn into a permanent colony. When Tinghai's government found a British war fleet off their coast, they sent out officials to ask the fleet what they were there for. The British told them to surrender the city, or they would take it by storm. The Chinese responded that while they knew they would lose a confrontation, they were duty-bound to resist. So on July 5th at 2 p.m., the British began their assault, destroying the fleet of war junks defending the city and landing troops to storm its walls. The Chinese were only capable of putting up weak resistance, so the city and the island chain as a whole were quickly captured. The landing party lost no time looting the city, during which time some of the marauding troops happened upon a distillery of a rice spirit called shamshu. So, soldiers being soldiers, they immediately got sloshed on the stuff. Remarkably, some of the city's owned people joined the foreigners in looting Tinghai. All of this led to fires breaking out throughout the city. On the same day as the looting of Tinghai, Rear Admiral Elliot arrived and immediately crashed his ship on a rock, forcing him to send it back to repairs and to transfer his command to another ship. The British spent some time on Chusan fortifying the island and dealing with a couple of problems. Survivors from a British shipwreck were captured by the Chinese and imprisoned alongside an artillery captain who was kidnapped in an unrelated incident. Warships were sent to Ningpo where they were being held. While they couldn't convince the Chinese to release the prisoners, they did at least secure better conditions for their imprisonment. At around the same time, Chinese troops were gathering outside of Macau, likely for an assault against the city. In response, ships and troop transports were sent to storm the coastal batteries that were being constructed there. The batteries kept up fire until the soldiers reached dry land, which prompted the gunners to abandon their position, leaving the British in control of the field. This Battle of the Barrier would be the last military operation for the year 1840. During the lull, the British were reinforced with more ships and soldiers, including the ironclad steam-powered warship Nemesis. Her shallow draft proved especially useful in the green and brown water fighting that would characterize much of the Opium War. The Chinese would soon come to call her the Devil Ship. Rear Admiral Elliot also took this opportunity to relinquish his command due to poor health. On August 30th, Charles Elliot met with Chinese officials to negotiate an end to the war. They suggested heading back to Canton to negotiate there. This move would have been favorable to the Chinese because it moved the fleet away from key cities, but Elliot accepted the condition anyway in good faith. Negotiations would drag on until January of 1841, when Elliot realized that the Chinese were just playing for time. So to force them into taking the expedition more seriously, he walked away and had the expedition attack the forts at Chuenpi and Tai Kok To. There, the Nemesis proved her worth, using her shallow draft to deliver close fire against coastal batteries, and her rocket armament to burn the wooden Chinese war junks. The British prepared to carry out more attacks, but were stopped when the Chinese agreed to re-enter negotiations. This time, they would prove fruitful. Elliot had been given specific instructions from the British government for what concessions he should demand. These demands included extraterritoriality for British citizens, the cession of an island for a crown colony, ideally Chusan, opening more cities to foreign trade, an end to the Han trade monopoly, forcing the Chinese to pay for the cost of the expedition, as well as for the destroyed opium that technically started this war, and finally, for the legalization of opium in China. But Elliot considered those terms to be way too harsh, so he totally ignored them in favor of a compromise peace. Elliot's treaty, the Convention of Chuenpi, only secured an indemnity of $6 million to cover the cost of the destroyed opium, with no compensation for the cost of the expedition. Chuenpi also secured the right for British merchants to set up permanent residency in Hong Kong, but would not make the island into a British colony. And finally, normal trading would be reopened at Canton, but nowhere else, and remain under the control of the Han monopoly. Chuenpi was viewed as ridiculous by both sides. The Chinese thought they had given up way too much, while the British government's demands, which Elliot had ignored, were so extreme specifically because they wanted every dispute settled and prevent the need for another expensive war. Both Elliot and his Chinese counterpart would soon be sacked by their governments, but not before it was briefly put into effect, meaning the British abandoned Chusan and took formal possession of Hong Kong. But even before either government rejected the treaty, hostilities would continue on their own. The British and Chinese would fight two skirmishes, known as the Battle of the Bogue and the Battle of the First Bar. Incredibly, in spite of being the seventh major engagement of the conflict, the Battle of the First Bar was the first exchange of fire to see a British combat death. All other British casualties were either wounds or deaths as a result of attrition. This was after the British had already inflicted thousands of casualties on the Chinese, including many destroyed warships. Before hostilities would formally renew, a new important commander arrived to lead the British ground forces, Sir Hugo. The very same Hugo who would command the British to their miraculous victory in the First Anglo-Sikh War. On May 24th, 1841, the British war fleet off the coast of Canton fired their guns in salute for Queen Victoria's birthday. Immediately after, they assaulted the city, beginning the Second Battle of Canton. The British faced stiff resistance here, first from the forts defending the approaches to the city, and then from Canton itself. This caused the British to suffer their worst casualties yet, at 15 dead and 112 wounded. But before the British had to carry out their final assault, Elliot was able to secure the city's surrender under terms including a $5 million ransom. This success was then followed by a strange incident. The British spotted a large gathering of armed villagers near Canton. Believing that they were preparing some kind of attack, several companies of soldiers were moved to check their advance, and then to disperse them with gunfire. The party then found and burned one of their villages in retaliation. As the soldiers prepared to return to the ships, a thunderstorm gathered, and several thousand armed villagers reappeared and attacked them. With the soldiers' flintlocks made useless by the rain, the British held them back with concrete rockets and bayonets, but were eventually forced to withdraw. Amidst the confusion, a company of Indian troops got detached from the rest of their unit. These lost soldiers were quickly found by the villagers and attacked, but they maintained discipline and performed an orderly retreat to a nearby hill, forming up in a defensive square. But their guns were just as soaked as everyone else's, restricting them to bayonets. It seemed the Indians' fates were sealed when the villagers found a cannon with which to pummel them from a distance. This would have left the soldiers with no choice but to charge the impromptu battery, which would have certainly led to their deaths. But this suicidal maneuver was stopped when at the last moment, 2 companies of Royal Marines arrived. The Marines poured fire into the villagers using their new percussion cap muskets, which were unaffected by the rainfall. With the villagers defeated, all of the soldiers were able to return to the fleet in good order. These events are referred to as the Sun Wan Li incident, named for one of the nearby villages which the peasants likely emerged from. One of the most remarkable points of the incident is that the Chinese government denied any involvement with the peasants, meaning they most likely acted on their own. This goes to show just how little faith the Chinese had in their own government to defend them, a problem that would only get worse in the coming decades. The month of June 1841 was spent preparing Hong Kong for British settlement. But the British were very unsuited to the island's climate, since it was essentially a swamp. As a result, these first attempts at colonization were mostly rewarded with malaria. And, if that wasn't bad enough, the islands were also struck by a typhoon. It was during this period when Charles Elliot was recalled to England, and his convention of Chuenpi was annulled. The fleet resumed action on August 21st, with its final objective in the city of Ningpo. Along the way, they captured the city of Amoy and recaptured Chusan. At Chusan, the Chinese offered particularly stiff resistance thanks in large part to the British-built fortifications there. As a result, recapturing the island cost the British 29 casualties, 2 of which were deaths. After taking another position called Xinhai, the Nemesis was sent forward to scout out Ningpo. Then, a small force was landed to begin their assault. As soon as they passed through the city gates, her people surrendered. Thus, a city of 300,000 souls was captured by 750 men. The British would spend some time at Ningpo, where the expedition suffered some of its worst losses from cholera, but the Chinese would not sit down and allow themselves to be outdone by attrition. The Chinese were going to finally seize the initiative and begin their counterattack. The British remained at Ningpo through the winter of 1841 to 1842, the cold improving their health situation considerably. While the expedition rested, the Chinese busied themselves maneuvering forces and building defensive constructions around the city. Chinese civilians also made various attempts at kidnapping British soldiers to claim bounties from their government. A common strategy was to invite a soldier into their home for drinks, get him drunk enough that he could no longer defend himself, bind him, and then cart him off to the nearest official. The British eventually captured 2 would-be kidnappers and publicly hanged them, which stopped most future attempts. Reports would eventually arrive of an incoming Chinese attack on Ningpo, but the British considered those reports too vague to be believable, which was unfortunate because they were absolutely true. On the night of the 8th to 9th of March, Chinese forces launched a surprise attack on Ningpo, but the surprise was lost when a British sentry spotted and shot one of the attacking soldiers, waking the expedition. Chinese forces had already entered the city from the south gate, but the British arrived at the west gate in time to save it. But the Chinese who had entered would soon be driven back with close-range musket fire and bayonets. Eventually, as in all prior battle, superior British drill and firepower beat back their much more numerous foes. British estimates put the Chinese force at 5,000 men. If this is true, then it's all the more remarkable that they only managed to inflict 3 wounds on the heavily outnumbered British. After the battle, Hugo arrived with reinforcements, but since the enemy had already been driven out, he used this relief force to launch counterattacks. Armies of several thousand troops had been spotted nearby at Fenghua and Ceki. Hugo led his force to attack Fenghua first, but the Chinese retreated without resistance, so he then attacked Ceki, which put up a fight. Naturally, Hugo won this battle too, at the cost of 3 dead and 19 wounded. After the failed Chinese counterattack, initiative returned to the British, who thought it was high time to force an end to the conflict. They would accomplish this by striking at the agricultural and commercial heart of China, the wealthy and massive cities of the Yangtze River Valley. Taking the empire's key waterway would finally force the Chinese to give in to Britain's demands. On May 6, 1842, after withdrawing from Ningpo, the expedition sailed for Shanghai. They were briefly stopped by fierce resistance at Chapu, defeating it at the cost of 13 dead and 15 wounded. But those losses were more than made up for by the thousands of casualties they inflicted on the Chinese. The fleet then moved on to Shanghai. There would be fighting at the forts along the city's approaches, but the city itself only put up token resistance, leading to an easy British victory. The final battle of the Opium War would be fought further up the Yangtze River, at the city of Qingqiang. This would be the most hard-fought battle of the war. The British only won it after engineers blew up the city's west gate and another force escalated her walls. But in the end, like all other Chinese positions before her, Qingqiang fell to the expedition. This victory came at the highest cost of the war: 34 British killed and 107 wounded. The British prepared to move on to Nanking, but were stopped when the Chinese agreed to enter peace talks aboard the warship Cornwallis. There, they hammered out the Treaty of Nanking. This treaty included nearly all of Britain's original demands, including opening the ports of Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo, and Shanghai to foreign trade, forcing the Chinese to pay out $21 million over the next several years, $6 million of which was earmarked for the destroyed opium, ending the Han trade monopoly, and forcing the Chinese to cede Hong Kong to Britain as a crown colony. While the Treaty of Nanking would officially end the First Opium War, there would be one last major loss of life before its signing, in an event known as the Nerbudda Incident. This was when the British transport ship Nerbudda, with over 200 Indian passengers, ran aground on Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. The ship's British passengers escaped alongside a few of the Indians, but the rest were left behind on the island. After hiding out for 7 days, the lack of supplies forced the marooned Indians to seek help from local Chinese, who killed some of them and imprisoned the rest. The same exact thing also happened to the majority Indian crew of the Anne, that also crashed on Formosa. Up to 90 prisoners from both ships would perish from abuse and neglect, before most of the remaining survivors, roughly 200 people, were executed. Only a few men would survive this ordeal to be released by the Treaty of Nanking. And so, in the First Opium War, the Qing Empire, ruling over a quarter of the world's population, was brought to its knees by a small British war fleet. Over the course of the entire war, the Qing only managed to inflict 512 combat casualties on their invaders, less than a quarter of which were deaths. So leave a sailboat emoji in the comments to commemorate Britain's victory in one of their last major naval operations fought primarily with sail-powered warships. In all discussions surrounding the Opium War, much is made of the failures of the Macartney Embassy. After all, if relations between China and Britain had not soured at the start, perhaps they could have remained peaceful. The Chinese would have been more inclined to allow the British to trade in their country, so the British wouldn't have felt the need to resort to violence. And sure, there's a lot to be said about that, but not nearly enough is said about the Qing's own role in ruining their relations with the West. For nearly all of its history, Chinese diplomacy operated on a tribute system. Foreign powers would come to China, literally the Middle Kingdom, to show submission and offer tribute to the emperor. In return, China would grant them trade deals and other diplomatic arrangements as gifts. Making these agreements into gifts implied that the Chinese had no actual need for foreign help, thus maintaining them as the highest status nation in the system. The entire tribute system was built on the immense power imbalance between China and its tributaries. Without it, China could not impose these humiliating conditions on anyone. And that power imbalance is exactly what was missing in China's relationship with the West. As the Opium War revealed, it was actually the Europeans who were the stronger power. And yet the Chinese continued to insist on a tributary relationship anyway. In a sense, the Chinese had no choice, because the legitimacy of every Chinese dynasty rested, in part, on its ability to extract obeisance from foreign powers. But the Europeans had their own prestige and legitimacy to maintain. Could a European nation really claim to be a free and independent power if its ambassadors were being made to kowtow to Asiatic despots? So was it truly wise for the Qing to treat the European states as tributaries? Should the Qing have really insulted these powerful nations, who really only wanted to peacefully trade with them, until the insults and trade restrictions piled up to the point where force of arms could be their only resolution? None of this is a moral condemnation of China's actions in the lead up to the war. The cause of the Opium War was, as its very name would suggest, totally shameless on the part of Britain. But this is absolutely a foreign policy and strategic condemnation of China. Because, in the situation the Qing had created for themselves, if not over opium, conflict would have surely broken out over something else. Or in other words, if the Qing's goal were to maximize their chances of fighting an unwinnable war with a European power, would they have acted any differently? The Opium War ended on the 29th of August, 1842, but that didn't mean the fighting between China and the West was over. Really, it was just beginning. The Treaty of Nanking hadn't even touched on the issue of opium legalization, because the Chinese negotiators simply refused to discuss it. Nanking only mentions opium once, and only as the commodity that the Chinese were compensating the British for having destroyed. As a result, the British quickly found Nanking to be insufficient, so signed the Supplementary Treaty of the Bogue. This treaty gave Britain Most Favored Nation status, meaning that any concessions China gave to another power had to also go to Britain, as well as finally granting extraterritoriality to British citizens, meaning they were immune to Chinese law and answerable only to British law even while in China. Nanking and the Bogue would only be the first of many so-called unequal treaties with the West, because in 1844, France and the United States would jump onto the bandwagon and sign their own unequal treaties with China, though they wouldn't have to go to war for theirs. Their treaties were very similar to the British ones, including Most Favored Nation status. And, as a Catholic power, the French added an end to the Chinese ban on Catholicism. And yet, in spite of all of that, the Treaty of Nanking, the Supplementary Treaty of the Bogue, and the French and American unequal treaties, the Western powers still hadn't sated their lust for China. Hostilities between China and the Western powers would continue, eventually leading to another Opium War. And, as the foreign wolves were circling, China was about to enter another civil war. But that's all outside the scope of this video, because this has been the First Opium War. This video was funded by the Qing dynasty, as stipulated by the unequal treaties negotiated by this channel's chief plenipotentiaries, Josiah and Pater, and by this video's sponsor, War Thunder. Use our exclusive link in the description to get a free bonus pack, including vehicles, boosters, and more. Links to where you can support us directly are also in the description. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one.
I can't escape the poppy's curse, always need something more. 'Cause when Eve bit to the apple's core, the first shots were fired in the Opium Wars. Still fight these opium